On December 16th, 1944, the Allied forces in Europe believed victory was within their grasp. Months of relentless advances had pushed the Germans back to their borders, and the end of the war seemed tantalizingly close. But in the dense, fog-shrouded forests of the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler unleashed a desperate gamble that shattered every expectation. Over 200,000 German troops, backed by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, surged forward in the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. It wasn't just an attack. It was a thunderbolt designed to split the Allies in two, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The front lines crumbled under the weight of surprise and superior numbers. American soldiers, many green replacements caught off guard in the bitter cold, faced annihilation as panzer divisions tore through weakly defended positions. By December 19th, the situation had deteriorated into chaos. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower stared at maps that no longer made sense, his headquarters buzzing with urgent cables and grim reports. The German Ardennes offensive, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, had created a massive salient protruding 50 miles into Allied territory. Towns fell like dominoes, supply lines were severed, and entire units vanished into the winter mist. In this maelstrom, one town emerged as a linchpin of the entire crisis, Bastogne. Nestled at the crossroads of 7 major roads in southern Belgium, Bastogne wasn't just a dot on the map. It was the gateway to the Meuse River and beyond. If the Germans seized it, they could flood westward unimpeded, potentially encircling hundreds of thousands of Allied troops. Eisenhower knew this instinctively. Losing Bastogne would unravel the Western Front like a pulled thread. Surrounded by the elite 101st Airborne Division and elements of the 10th Armored Division, about 18,000 men in total, the town became a fortress under siege. These paratroopers, dubbed the Screaming Eagles, had jumped into Normandy on D-Day and fought through Holland in Operation Market Garden. Now, they dug in amid snowdrifts and sub-zero temperatures, their foxholes carved from frozen earth that resisted shovels. Ammunition was plentiful at first, but food and medical supplies dwindled rapidly. Morphine froze in syringes, and plasma had to be thawed over open flames. The Germans, confident in their momentum, tightened the noose with artillery barges that shook the ground like earthquakes, while tanks probed the perimeter under cover of endless blizzards. Eisenhower, a master of coalition warfare, convened his top generals in Verdun that same day. The room was thick with tension. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery advocated a cautious regrouping, while American commanders pushed for aggressive action. Then, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., the flamboyant leader of the Third Army, stepped forward. Known for his pearl-handled revolvers and unyielding drive, Patton had already anticipated the crisis. His forces, positioned 100 miles to the south and facing east toward the Saar, were primed for a daring pivot. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours, Patton declared, his voice steady amid the skepticism. It was an audacious claim. Pivoting an entire army, over 250,000 men, 800 tanks, and thousands of vehicles, northward in the dead of winter seemed suicidal. Roads were iced over, bridges strained under weight, and fuel supplies were already stretched thin by the offensive's disruption. Yet Patton's staff had worked through the night, rerouting convoys and recalculating logistics. He wasn't bluffing. Elements of his army were already shifting. Eisenhower, ever the strategist, weighed the risks. Failure could expose Patton's flank to counterattacks, potentially losing an irreplaceable force. But inaction meant Bastogne's fall, and with it, the offensive's containment. Drawing on his experience from North Africa and Sicily, where he had managed Patton's bold tactics before, Eisenhower nodded. "Go ahead, George." Orders flew out. The Third Army would disengage from its current front, swing 90 degrees north, and drive through hostile terrain to relieve Bastogne. This maneuver, often overlooked in broader histories, involved crossing the Moselle River, navigating narrow valleys prone to flooding, and contending with German spoiling attacks. Patton's engineers worked miracles, repairing sabotaged bridges under fire and laying corduroy roads from felled trees to prevent vehicles from bogging down in mud and snow. Meanwhile, in Bastogne, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the defense with iron resolve. His troops repurposed captured German weapons, rationed care rations to 1 per day, and used white bedsheets for camouflage against the snow. Civilians, caught in the crossfire, sheltered in basements as shells rained down, their homes reduced to rubble. The 101 Estes artillery, the Long Toms, fired back with precision, conserving shells for critical moments. As Patton's columns rolled out on December 22nd, the weather turned even more unforgiving. A low-pressure system dumped fresh snow, reducing visibility to mere yards and grounding Allied air support. See, 47 transport planes, loaded with vital supplies, sat idle on runways in England. Eisenhower monitored the advance from his headquarters in Versailles, poring over aerial reconnaissance photos that revealed German reinforcements streaming into the Bulge. He diverted resources from quieter sectors, including fuel from the First Army, to sustain Patton's push. Little-known details emerged in declassified reports. Patton consulted chaplains for a weather prayer, beseeching divine intervention for clear skies, a move that underscored his blend of mysticism and pragmatism. By December 23rd, Third Army units like the 4th Armored Division had covered 30 miles, clashing with elements of the 5th Panzer Army in villages like Bougainville. Skirmishes were fierce but calculated. Patton emphasized speed over total destruction, bypassing strong points to maintain momentum. Inside Bastogne, hope flickered amid despair. Radio intercepts hinted at relief efforts, boosting morale. Soldiers shared stories of home to stay warm, while medics performed surgeries in candlelit churches, saving limbs with improvised techniques. The Germans, under Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, sensed vulnerability and demanded surrender on December 22nd. McAuliffe's legendary one-word reply, "Nuts," epitomized American defiance, a morale booster that echoed through the ranks. As Christmas approached, Patton's forces pressed on, their tracks churning through the white landscape toward a rendezvous that would redefine resilience. The stage was set for a clash where human will triumph over the elements, turning a potential disaster into an enduring testament to strategic brilliance. On the morning of December 22nd, 1944, the sky above the Ardennes remained a solid gray blanket, thick enough to smother hope. Inside Bastogne, the temperature had dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius, and the men of the 101st Airborne were burning the last scraps of anything that could produce heat. Fence posts, broken furniture, even pages torn from captured German maps. Their breath hung in white clouds that never quite dissipated. Frostbite had already claimed toes and fingers. Medics amputated blackened limbs with pocket knives when gangrene set in too fast. Yet no one talked to surrender. They had heard the German loudspeakers blaring promises of warm food and safe passage if they laid down their arms. The only answer came in the form of sporadic rifle cracks from the perimeter. Far to the south, Patton's Third Army was in full motion, a steel serpent uncoiling across frozen countryside. The 4th Armored Division led the charge, its Sherman tanks grinding forward at barely 10 miles per hour on roads never designed for such weight. Drivers kept engines running constantly to prevent freezing, burning fuel at a terrifying rate. When a tank threw a track or slid into a ditch, the entire column halted while crews worked in numb silence, hands wrapped in rags, tools slipping from frozen fingers. Patton moved among his units like a man possessed, standing upright in his jeep, barking orders through the wind. "Keep moving," he repeated. "The bastards think we're finished. Prove them wrong." Behind the armor came truck convoys carrying ammunition and medical supplies, their canvas tops flapping like torn flags. Engineers bridged every stream and crater with whatever timber they could fell, sometimes under harassing artillery fire that arrived without warning. At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, Eisenhower received hourly updates that painted a picture of agonizingly slow progress. The original 48-hour promise had already slipped past. The spearheads were still 30 miles from Bastogne when darkness fell on December 22nd. Eisenhower did not panic. He had learned long ago that war rewards patience as much as boldness. He quietly approved the transfer of additional fuel trucks from the 9th Army and ordered every available fighter group to stand by for first break in the weather. In private, he confided his chief of staff, "If the sky doesn't open soon, we may lose both Bastogne and Patton's momentum in the same hour." That same afternoon, 4 German officers under a white flag approached the American lines on the western edge of Bastogne. They carried a typed ultimatum demanding unconditional surrender within 2 hours, promising honorable treatment if accepted and annihilation if refused. The document was handed to a lieutenant, who carried it straight to Brigadier General McAuliffe. The general read it once, then looked up with the faintest trace of a smile. "They want us to surrender?" he asked. "Us." He paused only a moment before replying with a single word that would echo through history. "Nuts." His staff erupted in laughter, the first real laughter anyone had heard in days. The reply was typed on a piece of paper, tucked into an envelope, and returned to the Germans under escort. When the enemy officers read it, they were visibly confused. An interpreter finally explained the meaning. Their faces darkened. Within minutes, fresh artillery shells began crashing into the town. The word "nuts" spread like wildfire through the foxholes. Men who had been too cold and tired to speak now grinned through cracked lips and repeated it to one another. It wasn't bravado. It was defiance forged in shared misery. They knew the Germans were listening on open frequencies. Let them hear it. Let them understand that this tiny crossroads town had no intention of becoming another footnote in their advance. By the evening of December 23rd, the weather finally cracked. Thin streaks of blue appeared in the western sky, then widened. The overcast ceiling lifted just enough for sea. 47 Skytrans to take off from English airfields. 19 planes flew low over Bastogne, dropping bundles of ammunition, medical kits, and rations attached to colored parachutes. Some drifted into German lines, but most landed inside the shrinking American perimeter. Soldiers sprinted through shell bursts to drag the canisters back to cover, tearing them open with bayonets. Plasma bottles, sulfur powder, and boxes of .30 caliber cartridges spilled across the snow. One trooper held up a frozen K ration and shouted, "Merry Christmas, boys!" The drops continued into the afternoon as the sky cleared further. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings roared overhead, strafing German armor and supply columns that had previously moved with impunity. For the first time since the siege began, the Germans felt the weight of Allied air power pressing down on them. Patton seized the moment. His armored spearheads accelerated. The 4th Armored Combat Command be smashed through German delaying positions near Chaumont, destroying a dozen Panzer IVs, and a swirling tank duel fought at ranges under 300 yards. Burning hulks lit the snow orange against the darkening sky. Infantry followed, clearing villages house by house. German resistance grew more desperate. Small groups fought to the last round, then melted back into forests to set up new ambushes. Yet the American tide kept rising. By nightfall on December 23rd, Patton's lead elements were less than 15 miles from Bastogne. The gap was closing, not quickly, not cleanly, but relentlessly. Inside the besieged town, the airdrops transformed exhaustion into grim determination. Wounded men received fresh morphine and bandages. Machine gun belts were refilled. Artillery observers adjusted fire with renewed confidence. McAuliffe moved among the lines, speaking quietly to small groups of men huddled around fires no bigger than a helmet. He didn't promise victory. He simply reminded them that help was coming, and that every minute they held made that help matter more. No grand speeches, just the truth delivered in calm, measured tones. Eisenhower, tracking the converging forces on a situation map, allowed himself one small private gesture. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly, and said to no one in particular, "The weather broke. Now, let's see if George can finish what he started." Across the Ardennes, the battle had entered its decisive phase. 2 armies, one trapped and defiant, the other racing through ice and steel, were about to meet. The outcome would not be decided by maps or timetables alone, but by the stubborn refusal of men to yield when everything told them they should. On December 24th, 1944, Christmas Eve dawned cold and quiet over the Ardennes, but the silence was deceptive. Inside Bastogne, the perimeter had shrunk to less than a mile across in places. German artillery walked methodical patterns across the town, shattering what remained of stone houses and forcing defenders deeper into cellars and ruined churches. The 101st Airborne and their attached units had learned to move only when shells were not falling, to speak in whispers, to conserve every round. Yet something intangible had changed. The airdrops the day before had delivered not just supplies, but proof. The outside world had not forgotten them. Colored parachutes still littered the snow like forgotten holiday decorations. Men tore open ration boxes and found chocolate bars stamped from the people of the United States. Small gestures, but in that frozen hell they carried the weight of entire armies. South of the town, Patton's spearheads were closing the final miles with ferocious urgency. The 4th Armored Division's Combat Command A, now spearheaded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' 37th Tank Battalion, pushed through the village of Bastogne under heavy fire. German anti-tank guns hidden in hedgerows opened at point-blank range. Shermans brewed up one after another, their crews bailing out into snowdrifts while machine guns raked the ground. Abrams, standing in the turret of his command tank Thunderbolt 4, directed fire with calm precision, knocking out 3 88mm guns in quick succession. Behind the armor, infantry from the 26th Infantry Division cleared the woods on either flank, rooting out Panzerfaust teams that waited in silence for the tanks to pass. The fighting was close, brutal, personal, bayonets, grenades, and pistols at ranges measured in feet. By mid-afternoon, the leading elements reached the edge of the German main defensive belt south of Bastogne. Here the enemy had concentrated what remained of 2 Volksgrenadier divisions and scattered panzer reserves. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew their entire offensive hung on delaying this single thrust. Yet the American pressure was unrelenting. Patton had ordered no pauses, no consolidation, only forward movement. When one road became impassable, columns simply detoured through fields, accepting the risk of mines and bogging down, because stopping meant failure. At 1650 on December 26, the moment arrived. A platoon of Shermans from the 37th Tank Battalion, supported by half-tracks carrying paratroopers from the 326th Glider Infantry, broke through the last line of German resistance along the main highway into Bastogne. They rolled past smoking German wrecks and abandoned positions until they reached the American outposts on the southern edge of town. A paratrooper sergeant, face blackened with soot and frost, stepped out of foxhole, raised his hand, and shouted, "Where the hell have you guys been?" An armored infantryman in the lead half-track grinned back and yelled, "We've been looking for you." The corridor was open, narrow under fire and far from secure, but it was open. Word raced through Bastogne faster than any radio message. Men who had not smiled in 10 days began to laugh, to slap each other on the back, to cry without shame. Medics carried wounded toward the corridor on improvised litters. Trucks loaded with ammunition and plasma moved north under covering fire from P-47s that now circled overhead in relays. The first jeep carrying a medical team rolled into the town square just after dark. A medic jumped out, looked around to gaunt, bearded faces staring back at him, and said, simply, "We made it." No one needed more words. Eisenhower received the confirmation at Versailles shortly after 1700 hours. He studied the map for a long moment, then turned to his staff. "The corridor is holding," he said quietly. "Now we widen it." There was no celebration, only the immediate shift to the next task. Orders went out to reinforce the relief route with additional armor and anti-tank units. Patton was already pushing elements of the 4th Armored farther north to expand the gap while the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions attacked eastward to protect the flanks. The German command, realizing the siege had failed, began pulling back key units to prevent encirclement of their own forces. The momentum of their offensive, once unstoppable, had been broken. In the days that followed, Bastogne transformed from a besieged island into a forward operating base. Fresh divisions poured through the corridor. Patton's Third Army continued its drive, rolling up German positions from the south, while British and American forces in the north pressed down to pinch off the Bulge. The weather stayed clear, allowing Allied air forces to hammer supply lines, rail yards, and retreating columns without mercy. German fuel shortages, already critical, became catastrophic. Tanks were abandoned along roadsides when their engines sputtered dry. What had begun as Hitler's last great gamble in the West ended as a slow, grinding retreat. The relief of Bastogne did not win the war by itself, but it stopped a catastrophe that could have delayed victory by months. The 101st Airborne lost over 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during the siege, yet they never gave ground. Patton's Third Army suffered heavily in the relief operation, burning through men, machines, and fuel at a pace few commanders would have risked. Eisenhower later wrote that the pivot of an entire army in winter against every rule of logistics and weather was one of the boldest decisions of the campaign. He also admitted privately that he had accepted the possibility of losing Patton's force entirely if the thrust failed. Yet the gamble succeeded because of three interlocking truths. First, the defenders of Bastogne refused to break, turning a tactical position into a strategic symbol. Second, Patton's relentless drive overcame terrain and time through sheer force of will and meticulous staff work. Third, when the skies finally cleared, Allied air power returned to its dominant role, punishing the Germans at every turn. Together, these elements reversed the offensive that had threatened to fracture the Western Front. Years afterward, when historians asked Eisenhower what he remembered most about those December days, he did not speak of maps or orders. He spoke instead of the men inside Bastogne who held on when every calculation said they could not, and of the soldiers who fought through ice and steel to reach them. They did not wait for miracles, he said. They made one. That Christmas week in 1944, in a frozen corner of Belgium, ordinary men turned back the last major German offensive of the war, not with overwhelming force, but with something far more powerful, the refusal to yield. And because they refused, the road to Berlin, once threatened with collapse, lay open once more.